11 days after 9/11, I was on the train to New York City. It was a Friday. I was teaching a class at New York University on immigration. I hadn't been into the city since before the attacks. Trying to distract myself, I read Saskia Sassen's Guests and Aliens. It was going to be one of the main books for our seminar. Along the way, I can't remember when, a troop of policemen came onto the train. The train was at a station. They asked various people to follow them onto the platform. I was among them. We were asked some basic questions and then told to get back on the train. I've seen enough World War II films to know how I should feel. There was fear and there was anxiety. Would I, like so many others, be sent off to a deportation detention center? News reports of such removals had begun to sneak around like a fetid rumor among South Asian Americans. A Sikh man had already been killed in Arizona. Mistaken identity was the order of the day. My conversation with the officer was brief. He asked me what I was reading. It seemed that even a nonconformist book in English was sufficient to prove my academic credentials. No disrespect to Saskia Sassen, but a dog-eared and marked-up copy of her book would hardly be in the hands of a terrorist. That was, of course, wishful thinking. On October 29th, Tariq Ali was detained in Munich. The offending article, a slim volume in German, Karl Marx on suicide. Tariq had the mayor of Munich stand in as surety for him. As he wrote that day, it was a tiny enough scratch, but if untreated, these can sometimes lead to gangrene. The ethnic newspapers carried reports of more serious incidents. The mass arrests in the tri-state area, the development of the special registration program, and the sense of discomfort that more such arrests would come and we would have to suffer something like internment. The I word had come up even among politicians. It was not all fantasy. The irony in all this was that among the hijackers, none were from South Asia. They were Saudis and Egyptians and seemed to have spent most of their time in Europe, with only a brief detour for some in Afghanistan. Anthropological and geopolitical distinctions seemed to make no difference. It was sufficient if you resembled a terrorist. Olive skin, turbans, headscarves, facial hair, and other such tokens were the markers of danger. It is why Sikh men came into the dragnet early. Osama bin Laden also wears a turban. None of the hijackers wore turbans or had outward signs of religiosity. A terrorist does not announce himself or herself. That would defeat the purpose. But the visual sign is precisely what the racist would like to focus on, exactly what the terrorist would like to deny. The bodies of so many were stripped bare by this contradiction. The reaction inside Indian America and South Asian America reflected the limitations of our histories. It is through these histories and our locations within them that we can best understand the kind of responses to the post-9/11 period. It is also in our engagement with these histories that we can clarify the changes in our own understanding of ethnicity and politics, immigration and terror. Part 1, Twice-Born Generation. My brother moved to California in the 1980s, and I followed along. He worked in San Leandro, a town devoted to the maintenance of cars and car culture. On the weekend, the Indian American community would gather in each other's homes. The people in the room were warm and friendly, with the men in one room, the women in another, and the children in the basement or the den, with their, as they call them, home friends. I was too old to be with the kids, most of whom were born in the United States, and too young to mingle freely with the adults. That curious age allows one to wander between sets. I remain enthralled by two facts about these adults. First, that they were all highly educated men and women who held various kinds of professional jobs in their new country. Not more than a decade in their new land, they had already attained positions of prominence in their fields. Not as leaders, to be sure, but as accomplished technicians, as doctors, engineers, scientists, and even in the less sure world of mid-range business. Second, that they had almost no interest in politics or in the issues of the day. No one much like Reagan, but that seemed largely a temperamental thing. His casualness seemed inappropriate for a world leader. If the discussion turned to politics, it was most often about India. And here too, the trend seems staged. Either nostalgia for the kind of political talk of their college days, or animosity for this or that policy of the government. The textbook was India West and India Abroad, the newspapers of record for the Indian American community. Occasionally, there was a bit of guilt about leaving India behind, to be part of the brain drain. This led to the very rare bout of collective charity, to raise money for this or that orphanage, or school of the blind, or earthquake relief. Nearby Oakland burned with the futility of the modern world, but it would only come into our conversation if talk turned to the vegetables to be found at its Chinatown. Nothing of this should come as a surprise. The middle class in general seeks convenience and is loath to turn to politics when it might inconvenience one's daily life or one's sense of moral equilibrium. That's a universally enforced silence. Nor should it come as a surprise that the migrants who come to the United States after 1965 have no well-developed social obligation to the struggles that enabled them to have such success. The road to Indian America was paved by the struggles of others, now barely acknowledged. Born in the 1940s and 1950s, this generation of middle-class Indians missed the Indian freedom struggle. Some of them would have had parents or grandparents in the fight, but they themselves did not lift the cudgels for their homeland. When they went to school and college, now funded by the hard labor of their co-citizens in the new nation, they did not feel the weight of subordination and exclusion. It was a privilege to breathe the air of freedom and to feel part of a new dawn. That is the first birth of those who would become Indian Americans. Remember, this section is called Twice Born, so their first birth. The second birth is equal to the first. The United States barred Indians from entry into the country between 1924 and 1965. The law changed in 1965 as a result of the United States' fear of that the Soviets might overtake it in the science, technology, and arms race. The Soviet rocket Sputnik in 1957 sent fear into the spinal cord of the nation. The new immigration law allowed migrants to enter if they brought with them special technical and scientific skills as well as medical degrees, this to help staff the expanded Medicare systems also in operation from the mid-1960s. This was the reason why I was surrounded by doctors and engineers on those Friday nights. But the Immigration Act also came alongside two landmark laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. At least two generations of people sacrificed their lives and longings to overturn the injustice of Jim Crow. Because of that struggle, the new migrants who entered the universities and laboratories, hospitals and research centers could live with the formal promise of equality. Once more, the air of freedom and of a new beginning. Indian Americans did not know political struggles for freedom. In India, they were born after independence had been won, and in the United States, they arrived after the civil rights struggle already won them dignity and rights. This doubly privileged section also had the incredible fortune of state-supported education and state-selected immigration practices to give them the feeling that they were invincible. The massive social network that delivered them their advantages was invisible to them. Their blindness to their twice-born status was helped along by the US establishment media that championed them as a model minority, one who did not need welfare and overt state support. And it was also helped along by the Indian establishment, which by the 1980s celebrated their overseas success and longed for their surplus investments. Better brain drain, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi said, than brain in the drain. Part 2, Race and the Birth of the South Asian American. At those weekend parties, I would eat with the children. My task was to make sure that they didn't spill their drinks on the sofas and they would eat at least something without too much complaint. It was not an unpleasant task. They had much to offer in entertainment, naughty in the way of migrant children, thrown together, some related and some not, feeling comfortable in their skin among children who had similar parents and similar schoolmates. Two worlds that otherwise wouldn't know each other, but familiar to all of them. Of course, I was eager to be elsewhere. Too old for this, but with neither the cash nor the car to cry havoc in the world of my peers. Poor me. Years later, as a community organizer in Providence, Rhode Island, I met the peers of these children, now college students in their own right. I was running a campaign against tobacco advertisements in the areas of the poor, neighborhoods mainly populated by African Americans, Dominican Americans, and Hmong Americans. We got a spot on our local television channel. The next morning, I got a phone call from a student at Brown University. She was a representative, she told me, of the South Asian Students Association, and they wanted to see about doing some community service. A few days later, the SASA executive board came to see me on Lockwood Avenue. And imagine, I worked at a community organization in the heart of Providence, and these two fancy cars drive in, and all the doors open, like as if it's an FBI raid, and out of them pours about 50 South Asian American students from each car, all extremely formally dressed for a meeting with me, dressed very poorly, in my shabby office. Okay, they were nervous about being in this part of town, but eager to be involved. Everything about them moved me. The memories of the childhood of young adults like them in far-off California, and the reality that they wanted to devote some of their energy to matters far removed from their own lives and ambitions. Born in largely white suburbs, these young people also gathered on weekends to meet the children of immigrants like their parents. But they had been otherwise isolated from their parents' homelands. The occasional summer trip didn't mark their lives. They came of age on the wave of multiculturalism, which in the affluent and modest suburbs meant a great deal of tolerance for the educated migrant. It would all change a generation later when the migrants into the suburbs and exurbs were the working class Latinos. It was already difficult when the entrant was African or African American. The hierarchies of racial acceptance cushioned the Indians and their families. There are always the anecdotes of humiliation, but these were not central. When these young people went to college in the 1990s, a new form of racial belonging emerged. They became South Asian American, a term that doesn't refer to a place, South Asia, but to a sense of community amongst children of parents from the various countries of South Asia. These parents might not have that much in common. Sri Lankans would not necessarily meet socially with Pakistanis, but their children saw the connection intuitively. The content of their cultural lives might have been different, but the form was similar. South Asian parents with their own robust connections to their homeland and their own, sometimes anachronistic ideas about raising children, and American schools and friends on the other side with their own worldviews and expectations. It was this duality that was shared across these students. Scholar Sunaina Myra cleverly called this process reverse assimilation. The cultural links were the subjective connection. The other half, the objective basis for the emergence of the South Asian American, was the nature of social life on college campuses. College multiculturalism operated on the basis of a binary. There were the so-called normal students whose social life was already well provided for. And there were those other students who came from previously invisible populations. African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, some colleges women, lesbians and gays, and international students. To bring these students to life, the colleges and universities provided funds for organizations and events. It is in this space that the children of the Indian migrants found their association with children of migrants from Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal. There was often a minor struggle to gain a foothold in the Asian American organization, but that was not always serious. Most students created the equivalent of SASA, South Asian American Students Association. By 1989, the most energetic SASA organizations joined together to create an annual SASA conference, typically held in January. I first went to a SASA conference in 1996. Among the organizers were those who had come to seek me out 3 years previously. We had worked together on various projects, and they had been to some protests in downtown Providence. It was an education for all of us. For the SASA in 1996, they invited Urvashi Vaid, a leading voice in the gay and lesbian movement, as the keynote speaker. It was a singular choice. Unlikely that their parents would ever have chosen Urvashi to keynote one of the community events. That political gulf between the parents and the children could not have been any wider. The contradictions of social life on American campuses and the contradictions of American society had clarified many things for the South Asian Americans. The panels at SASA covered such themes as racism, sexism, homophobia, the role of religion, the place of the university, and so on. At one level, this could have been a Black students' conference or a Latino-Latina students' conference. The themes covered were the same, if the analysis and the context were different. Certainly, one should not be too rosy-eyed in this narrative. Many of those who worked in SASA or around it found ethnicity to be a viable platform for social mobility. SASA morphed for the graduates into the network of Indian or South Asian professionals. Even the national SASA had its downfall by 2003, when the students lost control of it to the party promoters, such as Intense Entertainment. Dharmesh Patel, who co-organized SASA at Dallas in 2000, told me a few years after that, the party promoters focus on profits, skimp on security, and truly undermine the original intent of the conference. The ideology of multiculturalism does allow ethnicity to be used to build a resume and to incorporate talented people from the hitherto disparaged communities into the upper reaches of society. But that's not the whole story. By the 1990s, as these young people left college, it was hard to walk into a non-profit organization anywhere in the United States and not find a South Asian American on the staff. It was equally difficult to find a civil rights legal office without a South Asian American. Taking the best of their advantages, and unlike many of their parents, they threw themselves into the wider political world. After all, unlike their parents, they were American and not always immigrants. And again, unlike their parents, they had lived the contradictions of coming of age in the United States. No privilege without recognition for most of them. But the children of 1965 had antecedents for this category, South Asian American. By the mid-1980s, South Asian women from New Jersey to the Bay Area formed organizations to take charge of an unmentioned violence against women and children. From Manavi to Narika, these organizations did not wish to associate themselves with the mainstream cultures of the subcontinent that promoted patriarchy as routine. To push against cruel cultural nationalism, these groups had separately from the college associations begun to use the term South Asian American. It was a term that would be adopted by South Asian American gay and lesbian organizations, as well as by culturally and politically progressive groups that took a pan-ethnic approach. Pan-ethnic groups, scholar Yen Lee Espiritu wrote in 1994, are products of political and social processes rather than cultural bonds. These often emerge, she argues, to contest systems of racism and inequality in American society. In this case, they emerge to contest systems of patriarchy and homophobia within the cultural world of the migrants. The pathway to South Asian America for the young college graduates in the 1990s was paved by these pioneers, who set up space in the activist and non-profit world for struggle in general, and now struggle as South Asian Americans. Part 3. There are only, I think, 4 parts. After 9/11. Before 9/11 was 1993. When Ramzi Yousef and his Confederates bombed the World Trade Center that year, a very gentle tremor of fear spread through the communities of those who might resemble terrorists. When I was in college in the 1980s, a few unimaginative acquaintances would occasionally call me, and I know it's unfortunate for the present, but they would call me Gaddafi. He was in the news a lot in that decade, having been a burr under Reagan's saddle. People like me had the misfortune of looking like your average terrorist. I had a long pseudo-afro in the 1980s, which provided the Gaddafi look, and by the 1990s, the shorter hair look that was au courant among the terrorists who came from the Gulf. So I've had 2, maybe 3 bad hair decades. The general sentiment among Indian Americans was dismay. Racism against the olive-skinned had begun to rise. This is reflected in the annual audits of the National Asian American Pacific Legal Consortium. By 1998, 32% of all assaults on Asian Americans took place against South Asians, compared to about 4.5% in 1995. Inside the Indian American community, which I knew best of all, the reactions were diverse. Some had taken refuge in an idea that traveled to them from India. The hardened Hindutva, or Hindu right, was at the high point of its campaign to transform Indian society from secularism to sectarianism, with the Muslim as the target. Drawing from this trend, some among the Indian Americans tried to make the case that they were Hindus and not Muslims. They wanted a get-out-of-jail card. Others dug deep into their own careers and lives, hoping against hope that this tide too would settle. And a few others began a conversation about profiling, linking the acute problem of racial profiling against blacks and Latinos by the police departments as agents of the state to the racial profiling against those who look like terrorists, here not by the state, but by society. These strategies provided respite, even if they ended up creating fissures between Hindus and Muslims. But they were not a sufficient respite. The bombing of the Oklahoma building by white supremacists was no comfort to the Indian Americans. The first reaction was that this was an act of violence by those who should be terrorists, and terrorists defined narrowly. Jim Stewart at CBS heard the news and went on the air to proclaim, "The betting here is on Middle East terrorists." It turned out that this was more Midwest than Mideast, but that didn't stop the pundits. A.M. Rosenthal of the New York Times insisted, whatever we are doing to destroy Mideast terrorism, the chief terrorist threat against Americans has not been working. I remember a second sense of panic. The backlash was on the horizon. It would come 6 years later. Nothing about 9/11 is easy to explain. There is, of course, the immense tragedy. There is also the geopolitical narrative of US military extension from the Hindu Kush to the empty quarter, of discontent for US economic and military support to both Israel and Egypt. There is, in addition, the aftermath, the moral panic within the United States that led to 2 wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, a wild foreign policy that led to the emergence of 2 nuclear powers, North Korea and Iran, and the alarm that produced the state's overreach, the special registration program, the prosecution of charities even remotely linked to terrorist groups, the FBI informant-driven arrests, and so on. As well, society's animosities, the fears of those who look like terrorists, and the killing of those who look like terrorists. In this miserable space, those Indian Americans who had taken refuge in Hindutva, or the Hindu right, now sought out allies in their further disavowal of Islam and Muslims. Some of them forged close ties with groups such as the American Jewish Community and the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. They formed the group that would become US INPAC and has some place in Washington, D.C. But they remain a minority, isolated in their biliousness. The majority dug deep, trying to camouflage their outward signs in patriotism. A Washington Post journalist came to visit a Sikh community leader in Washington, D.C., who told her, "We condemn harassment, we condemn terrorism, we are American, and we fully support the Bush administration." One of his nephews had just been shot at because he wore a turban. "We are united as Sikhs," the community leader told the reporter, "and as Americans." Patriotism was not, in this instance, the refuge of scoundrels. It was an act of desperation. The sharp edge of 9/11 racism brought many among the migrants toward the politics of the South Asian Americans. They took refuge in the organizations created by their children, groups that had previously created strong connections with the civil rights and civil liberties communities. Founded in 2000, South Asian American Leaders of Tomorrow, or SALT, was formed to develop leadership among the community with the intention to move young people into mainstream American politics. 9/11 changed SALT. It began to do documentary work on anti-South Asian violence in the United States, making connections with the Muslim and Arab organizations, as well as East Asian organizations, whose own history regarding internment had brought them into the picture. SALT produced two important documents to catalog the violence and the sense of despondency and fear. A report of the violence, American Backlash, Terrorists Bring War Home in More Ways Than One, from 2001, and a video of Community Talking Back, the community talking back, Raising Our Voices, South Asian Americans Address Hate, 2002. This was a genuine shift, bringing older and younger people into a political project to address the overt and covert violence. Over the course of the decade, SALT changed its name to better reflect its new agenda, South Asian Americans Leading Together. And they formed the National Coalition of South Asian Organizations. Its members include the old South Asian women's organizations, Narika, Manavi, Sakhi, and the organizations formed in the aftermath of 9/11, the Sikh Coalition, as well as the more youth and community organizations with an eye to more radical action, Desis Rising Up and Moving, and the South Asian Network. The political landscape had changed dramatically from the 1990s. One becomes a part of the fabric of a country by being a part of its struggles, to make sure that its putative values do not ossify. Belonging to anything does not come without a fight. Part 4, Long Distance Solidarity. And it'll open with a little poem from Gadar Di Gunj, 1914. The world derisively accosts us, O coolie, we have no fluttering flag of our own. Our home is on fire, why don't we rise up and extinguish it? Abject subjects of the British Empire, the overseas Indians in the 1910s recognized at least that they would not be treated as human beings as long as their homelands remained in bondage. That was established by the emergence of the Gadar Party in Stockton, California in 1913. By the way, they inaugurate Indian nationalism in California before Gandhi returns from South Africa, where he learned how to be an Indian. Gandhi, when he left Gujarat, was not really much of an Indian. He learns how to be an Indian in South Africa and goes back after the Gadar Party had already called for independence in Stockton, California. 10 years before the Indian National Congress will announce its aims of complete independence. Okay. That was established by the emergence of the Gadar Party in Stockton, California in 1913. They knew that there was a link between their own social standing and social identity and that of the foreign policy of the state in which they lived. The United States government and its people would regard Indians as coolies as long as the British had dominion over South Asia. It is this link between foreign policy and social life that has not held fast over the century. Today, many migrants believe that they can simply walk away from their homeland and rebuild their lives and identities in their new lands. This is simply not possible. The miasma of international relations interrupts our lives constantly. The concord between the generations has emerged slowly but surely in the world of US domestic politics. But there is no such mass platform to engage with the dilemmas of international relations. Some of this has to do with the differential state interests in South Asia, with those from India perhaps unwilling to take the view of those from Pakistan and vice versa. Such distinctions make it hard to even hold a bare minimum common understanding of the problem in South Asia and in the region around. Nor is there much agreement on the causes of terrorism, as Dick Cheney's maxim, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, remains alive and well. Imputed disagreements such as these make most organizations afraid to even try to forge a common understanding. Why start something that you think is fated to fail? Over the years, I've been involved with various efforts to create South Asian peace initiatives in the United States, as well as South Asian-led discussions on economic and political violence. The former, the peace initiatives, have indeed come to no good end. When it comes to foreign policy, particularly India-Pakistan relations, the temperature is not salubrious and has never been so. And it's worse across generations. There have been occasional signs, such as during the 1998 taxi strike in New York, which took place in the shadow of the nuclear tests in 1998 between India and Pakistan. Not one taxi driver that I met during the day of the strike, when 23,000 of the 24,000 taxi drivers went on strike. Not one taxi driver that I met in the shadow of this nuclear test wanted to touch the nuclear issue. Very clear that their solidarity in New York was far more important than the disagreements across the border in South Asia. Some of this was pragmatic. Don't let the nuclear test disrupt the taxi worker unity. But pragmatism is often a good place to begin a difficult conversation. Frequent convulsions on the border, at the time the ongoing civil war in Sri Lanka, violence in Bangladesh, and the rise of far-right politics in the region, far-right politics of religion in the region, hamper any attempt at dialogue. Discussions on political and economic violence have also been vilified for being outdated. If the Gadar militants wanted India to be free for their dignity, the Indian Americans of the 1990s and early 2000s wanted the Indian economy to shine as a way to be a proud Indian. Any talk of poverty or agrarian collapse rubbed against this tendency. It meant, of course, that one could not have a serious discussion about the rise of the political right, which has rested its claims on the dissatisfaction of the bulk of the population, now twisted away from the exploitation toward the belief that the path to a full belly is through the mosque or the temple. No real consideration of terrorist violence is possible without a serious conversation about the kind of economic policy pushed by the many Indians and Indian Americans who work at places like the World Bank, the IMF, Goldman Sachs, Pfizer, Pepsi, and so on. 9/11 is all about foreign policy. Its aftermath inside the United States affected Desis, South Asians and South Asian Americans and Indian Americans, who then forged responses of various kinds to racism and profiling. Little was done toward the root problem, the exertion of US power into the lands that stretch from the Western Sahara to the Philippines. 9/11 racism is a symptom of a much deeper problem. Neither the Indian Americans nor the South Asian Americans seem prepared to deal with that much more difficult, much graver issue, the overreach of American power into the Asiatic heartland. We've been able to acknowledge the hurdle of race. The next hurdle is imperialism. If we don't see it and work on it, racism, a consequence of imperialism, will persist. That is the message of Gadar, and it resonates. Thank you so much.
Do you think it's xenophobia, in fact, that has linked all people of olive skin in the expansion of racism after 9/11? Or do you think, or can you talk more about racism in such a way as to include South Indians?
Yes, very good question. I think that I would say that it's xenophobia because it peaked and then it disappeared largely. You know, after a few years there was embarrassment. You know, like in airports, people feel embarrassed. And I think even the security, they'll take other people. I've often stood in a queue and said, please take me, and they'll take the person after me. And they'll, you know, and I'm like, me, not this person with 3 children and, you know, harassed, and please let me substitute myself. Okay? So after a certain point, it began to dissipate. And that's why I think it was xenophobia. It's not structural. But the analysis that I have is this xenophobia will continue to appear it'll be punctuated at certain periods because there is a fundamental thing that has not been dealt with. That's why to be a Muslim in America is always going to be a certain kind of problem, but not always a problem. That is, you'll still have Muslims becoming doctors, heads of interfaith council, you know, maybe not allowed to build a mosque near, you know, within the vicinity of whatever. Okay, fine, all those things. But Muslims will still be able to rise. Whereas if you are from Springfield, Massachusetts, you know, maybe 0.1% of people in that elementary school class is going to have an income above $45,000. So that is systematic racism. That is the disposableness of the entire community. So I would say that with this kind of, what I'm talking about, these are episodic moments which are rooted, I would suggest, not in the domestic political economy, but in the international arena of hierarchies of different spaces. So why is it that after the explosion in North Africa, I talked to a lot of my Arab and friends both there and here, and the thing that keeps coming to me is, in a sense, the revolts in North Africa are the Arab world's answer to 9/11. The United States posted a letter after 9/11 saying you are a terrorist, and the Arab world has replied to the letter saying, no, we are not terrorists, we actually want democracy. So everybody here is thrilled. Why? Because now they can say, I am not Muhammad Atta, I am that Google executive. So these punctuations of xenophobia are related to the hierarchies of international geography, whereas the racism is rooted in the political economy domestically.
But don't you think the hierarchies of international geography can be linked to the creation of disposable populations just earlier? Or not? I mean, isn't that what a colonial population is? It's to some degree disposable?
Yes, absolutely sure. But, there are ways in which racism is the most wily fox. And so is xenophobia. It is able to shapeshift and move. The tragedy is that those of us who sometimes study these things see them as blocks. We want to define it in chapter 1 and then we sort of go along. But it continues to move. It's quicksilver. So our analysis is to keep up with it. I mean, why is it that, you can have, the head of Pepsi is an Indian woman. And she became the head of Pepsi after 9/11. So I'm not going to rub my hands and say, we are oppressed, and I'm not interested in that. Because that's not true. After 9/11, the head of Pepsi is an Indian woman. Okay? At the same time, the guy who argued the Hamdan case, I think it's Rumsfeld versus Hamdan, right? Is Neil Katyal, who is an incredible South Asian American who loves wine. We used to write for a magazine together. He wrote the wine column. And now, of course, he's in the Obama administration defending exactly the opposite policies he fought against when he was fighting cases in front of the Supreme Court. But in that sense, I would say that these are punctuated moments that appear. And they are rooted in those geographies. And if we don't deal with those geographies, I think what we end up with is these moments of respite until the next punctuation. 1993, 9/11, and then I wait for the next one. Which is why I say, if you're Arab American, you say, phew, we have replied to that letter that the Americans sent after 9/11. Thank God. Now, please, let there not be another terrorist attack. If there is, then they have replied back to us again, and then we'll have to reply again, and what's going on here? When can we say that our telegram that we send back is the final telegram? We are interested in democracy. Some clown might do something, but we are interested in democracy. That's what that's how international geography has to change. But that's rooted in America having to come to terms with oil, America having come to terms with, we can't go and bomb Libya and save the Libyans because that's going to harden Gaddafi. That's the hierarchies of international geography.